They stepped into the forest thinking they'd return by sunset. But the trees had other plans, and none of them were ever seen again. Tonight, Dread Scribe writes again. Before we begin, don't forget to like and subscribe for more chilling stories. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. I love seeing where everyone is tuning in from, and if there's a story you'd like me to cover next, I'd love to hear it too. I've walked these woods for nearly 20 years, and I used to think I understood them. Their moods, their rhythms, the way they swallow light and sound as dusk falls, all of it once felt predictable, almost comforting. But the day Elise Harper vanished, the forest felt like a stranger. She was 24, a biology student hiking alone on a trail that's safer than most city sidewalks. The path she chose was clear and well marked, a loop I could walk blindfolded. She texted her roommate a photo of a waterfall just after noon. That was the last anyone heard from her. By nightfall, we had a search team assembled, volunteers, deputies, canine units, the usual choreography of a missing hiker case. The air was heavy with that metallic scent pine forests carry before rain, and every radio crackle felt like a heartbeat. We followed her tracks easily at first, clean impressions of trail shoes in soft soil, the slight inward turn of her left foot. Then, just 100 yards past the overlook, they stopped. No scuff marks, no signs of a fall, not even a broken branch. It was as if Elise had walked to the center of that clearing and vanished into the air. We circled outward, sweeping the ground in widening arcs. Drones hovered above like metallic hawks, scanning for heat signatures. For a moment, hope flared, a faint thermal outline at the tree line. But when we got there, there was nothing but silence and the soft hiss of wind through needles. The dogs refused to enter that patch of forest. Their hackles rose, low growls trembling in their throats. I'd never seen them react that way, and neither had their handlers. It was as though something invisible stood between us and whatever was beyond. Some in the team muttered about sinkholes or hidden caves. Others spoke of predators, though none native to these woods could take someone without leaving a trace. My mind clung to science, thermal pockets, magnetic interference, maybe even optical illusions. But a small, colder thought crept in. What if we were dealing with something that didn't care about our explanations? The forest seemed to shift the longer we stayed there, its familiar map folding in on itself like a page written in a language we no longer understood. Days turned into weeks. Elise's parents came every morning, eyes hollowed by hope and dread, leaving with the same empty answers. The official search scaled back, but I couldn't let it go. I returned alone, retracing the same route, speaking her name aloud like a prayer. One evening, as twilight bled into the canopy, I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate, too heavy to be deer, too measured to be random. I turned, but nothing moved. Still, the feeling of being watched clung to me, as real as the damp earth beneath my boots. That night, reviewing drone footage again, I noticed something I hadn't before, a fleeting, upright shape slipping between trees just seconds after that strange heat signature faded. It wasn't Elise, it wasn't human. And as I stared at that grainy image, one thought rooted itself deep in my chest. Maybe she hadn't simply vanished. Maybe something had taken her. I didn't sleep. Dawn found me back at the clearing with fresh batteries and the stubbornness that gets rangers hurt. The air felt crosshatched and needles underfoot crackled like thin ice. I laid flagging tape in a careful grid, set 3 trail cameras on converging lines, and planted a data logger where the dogs had balked. If there was a pattern here, I meant to catch it, like sketching the outline of a ghost with borrowed light. By noon, the logger hiccuped. The magnetometer spiked, then went flat, then drew a sine wave as if someone had smoothed a scream. My radio hissed with a low, throat-deep vibration that made my molars ache. I spoke Elise's name again, just above a whisper. The sound hung, a silver thread between trunks, then sagged and vanished. But what I didn't expect was the answer. A soft footfall to my left, then another behind me, like a hand clap in an empty theater. I turned, camera raised the way you hold your breath before a plunge. Between 2 firs, shade collected into a shape taller than me, narrow and jointed long, an anatomy drawn wrong by a tired student. It moved with an economy I've only seen in apex predators, each step a subtraction. The lens hunted focus, stuttered, and cleared. For 1 second I saw something like a face, Not features, but the intention of them, the way frost suggests leaves on glass. Adrenaline lit my nerves like pricked wire. I backed toward the line the dogs had refused to cross, and the shape followed parallel, never closing, never retreating. I spoke again, not sure if I was pleading or bargaining. The magnetometer sang high, a mosquito whine. The wind hushed, and the clearing became a room holding its breath. My next step landed on soil that was soft and oddly warm, like a sleeping animal's flank. The grid of tape quivered, though there was no breeze. Cameras clicked, shutters popping like distant corn. A scent rose, damp stone, old coins, and something faintly sweet, like apples gone to cider. The shape tilted, listening or deciding. I realized I was standing where Elise's prints ended. My mind flashed the photograph she'd texted, the waterfall braided like rope, the joy in her posture. I said I was there to take her home. The forest answered with a sound like water turning in its bed. Everything moved at once. Heat bloomed at my ankles. The logger spooled nonsense. The tape snapped as if bitten. I fired a flare, and in that harsh bloom the shape emptied, folding like a shadow into a crease I couldn't see. The ground gave a sigh. When the echo died, the clearing was ordinary again. Like a stage after the actor's exit, dust still settling. I was alone. But at the grid's heart, a new set of footprints had appeared beside Elise's, mine, overlapping hers by a hair, toe to toe, as if we'd been standing there together all along. I carry that overlap like a second heartbeat. Some nights when wind combs the pines, I hear two sets of footsteps on my porch, out of step, like time itself learning how to walk. I remember the first time I heard the voice. It was faint, as if carried on a thread of wind, yet unmistakably human, a man calling for help somewhere deep in the timber. We had been searching for Adam Kellner for 3 days by then, a nature photographer known for venturing farther off trail than most would dare. His last message had been a photo of a crimson sunset bleeding through the pines, time-stamped just before dusk. After that, nothing. No calls. No movement on his GPS. Just silence swallowing a man whole. And now, 3 miles from where we believed he vanished, that silence was breaking. The search party froze. Again the voice came. "Help, please." Ragged, desperate, but wrong in a way I couldn't name. It echoed strangely, ricocheting between trunks with a metallic resonance, like shouting inside a cathedral built of wood and shadow. We pushed toward it, branches slapping our faces, the ground soft and breathing beneath our boots. But no matter how far we walked, the voice never grew closer. It hovered just ahead, always just beyond reach. We set up audio recorders, hoping to triangulate the source. When the data came back, it made no sense. The waveform was too clean, the spacing too precise. Each cry for help was separated by exactly 17 seconds. No deviation, not even a fraction of a beat. It wasn't a man shouting in desperation. It was a loop, like a recording caught in the canopy, playing on repeat. And yet there was no device, no speaker, nothing that could account for it. Some of the younger volunteers whispered about mimic birds, the way ravens can imitate human voices. But ornithologists ruled that out. This was too complex, too articulate. Others mentioned infrasound, low-frequency waves that distort perception and make humans hear phantom sounds. The forest here was full of geological quirks, limestone caverns, hollow-rooted trees, wind channels that could twist sound like ribbon. But none of those explained the precision. Nature was chaotic. This was engineered. That night we camped near the site, hoping to catch the voice again. At 2:13 a.m. it returned. "Help, please." 17 seconds apart, unwavering, like a metronome for the lost. Only this time a second voice joined it. Fainter, higher. It spoke a single word. "Here." The sound crawled beneath my skin. My flashlight swept the treetops, and for a moment I swore I saw movement. Something long-limbed and deliberate shifting between branches 30 feet above the ground. Morning brought new confusion. A bioacoustic specialist analyzed the recordings and noted subtle shifts in pitch. Microtonal changes no machine would bother with, as if the voice were learning, mimicking, adapting. But what it was mimicking, we couldn't say. The real Adam Kellner? Something else entirely. Still, the voice persisted, looping endlessly. And every time it repeated, it seemed to inch closer, threading through the air until it felt less like a distant cry and more like a whisper in my ear. One of the team members swore he heard his own name spoken softly between the loops. Another claimed he heard his mother's voice. I wanted to dismiss it as paranoia, tricks of the mind. But deep down, a thought began to coil tight in my chest. What if we weren't hearing echoes at all? The forest changed. What if something was calling? It wasn't just the sound anymore, and it was the air itself. Thick, heavy, charged, as if a thunderstorm had stalled above the canopy without rain. Even the crickets were silent, their absence louder than any noise. We had set up new recorders, high-fidelity microphones that could pick up vibrations below human hearing, and small parabolic dishes aimed at the treetops. Every piece of gear hummed, ready to catch whatever this phenomenon was. I told myself it was science guiding us forward, but beneath that, something primal whispered that we were trespassing where we shouldn't. At 3:07 a.m., the voice returned. "Help, please." 17 seconds. "Help, please." Again, unwavering. But now there was texture to it, a rawness that hadn't been there before. The tremor of breath, the catch of fear. It sounded real. My throat went dry. Then came the second voice. Closer, clearer. Here. It wasn't Adam's voice. It was mine. My knees buckled under the weight of that realization. Somewhere above us, something was repeating my voice back at me, syllable by syllable, like a mirror learning how to speak. The team panicked. One man bolted back toward camp but stopped dead just 10 feet away. He swore someone had whispered his name from behind a tree. Another volunteer claimed to hear her daughter singing a lullaby. None of us could find a source. Our thermal cameras showed nothing. Our night vision caught only darkness shifting against darkness. And yet, the voices multiplied. Dozens now, layered and overlapping, all calling from above. It was like standing beneath a choir of ghosts. We retreated to the edge of the clearing and brought the recordings to a linguist who specialized in anomalous vocal patterns. Her analysis made the hair on my arms rise. The phonetic structure wasn't random. It was converging, adapting. The longer we recorded, the more the voices aligned with human syntax, as if whatever was producing them was learning language itself. "It's not an echo," she whispered, staring at the screen. "It's an interaction." 2 days later, we brought in a drone swarm to sweep the canopy where the signals were strongest. One by one, the drones failed. Batteries drained faster than they should. GPS went haywire. One camera captured a flicker, not a shape exactly, but a distortion, like heat rising off asphalt. The same distortion we'd glimpsed near where Adam vanished. Only now, it was higher. Watching. Waiting. On the final night of the search, I went back alone. I don't know what I was hoping for. Closure, maybe, or forgiveness. The voice came again, softer now. "Help, please." 17 seconds here. And then, for the first time, a sentence. "You hear us now." My chest locked. Above me something stirred. A ripple among the branches, a suggestion of form where there should be none. And then silence. We never found Adam. We never found a source. The search was called off, reports filed, explanations drafted that satisfied no one. But sometimes when wind threads through these pines just right, I hear that voice again, always 17 seconds apart, always calling someone's name. I once believed the forest was mute, that its silence was indifference. Now I wonder if it has always been speaking, and we were simply too deaf, too certain. To listen, it began with a simple signal, a lonely ping from a missing man's phone, repeating from the same set of coordinates night after night. His name was Daniel Hurst, 32, an experienced solo camper who had set off into the northern sector of the forest 10 days earlier and never returned. Search teams had combed the area for a week with no trace, but that signal, unwavering, unchanging, was the only thread we had left. And so, at dawn on the 11th day, I led a small team toward that stubborn dot on the map, convinced that somewhere in those trees, Daniel was waiting to be found. Almost immediately, our instruments betrayed us. The GPS units jittered like nervous compasses, sending us in jagged, erratic directions. One moment we were headed north, the next our screens insisted we were marching west in a perfect circle. Compasses spun lazily, unable to settle. Even the satellite phone's signal wavered in and out, as though the air itself had become a curtain we were pushing against. I told the team it was likely a geomagnetic anomaly. Magnetic minerals in the soil, perhaps, or interference from buried iron deposits. Science offered explanations, and clinging to them was easier than considering the alternative. The forest here felt different, older somehow. The air was dense, almost viscous, and light filtered through the canopy in fractured, shifting beams. It reminded me of being underwater, where shapes bend and distances lie. By mid-afternoon, we had been hiking for nearly 5 hours, yet according to our watches, only 80 minutes had passed. It wasn't just our instruments faltering. Time itself seemed reluctant to behave. When we finally reached the coordinates, I felt an ache settle deep in my bones. The place was unremarkable, just a clearing ringed by spruce and pine with a patch of bare soil at its center. No campsite, no fire ring, no body. Yet our devices insisted Daniel's phone was right there, pulsing beneath our feet. We dug. We swept with metal detectors. Nothing. It was as if the signal was anchored to empty air. Then we saw the footprints. At first, they looked like the usual signs of a hiker's path, heavy-soled boots pressing into soft soil. But as we followed them, a pattern emerged. They circled a single tree in a tightening spiral, round and round, hundreds of times. No signs of stumbling, no breaks, no deviation, just a perfect obsessive orbit. It was impossible to tell how long someone had walked there, hours, days, weeks. But one thing was clear. Whoever made them hadn't left the clearing. They had simply vanished. The mood shifted. One volunteer swore the trees looked different from when we arrived. Their angles subtly altered, as if the forest were leaning in to listen. Another complained of vertigo, clutching his head as if the air itself were spinning. I checked my watch again. 6 minutes had passed since the last check. Or was it 60? Time, once a steady river, now felt like a whirlpool dragging us down, and just as the unease reached its peak, the satellite phone chimed. Another ping. Same coordinates. Same moment. But Daniel's phone had just powered on again. Only this time, the signal was moving. We stared at the receiver in stunned silence as the dot drifted slowly across the screen. For days, that signal had been fixed, immovable, like a tombstone marking the place where Daniel ceased to exist. Now it was moving, weaving lazily through the clearing before looping back on itself. It didn't follow any path a person would walk. It traced an inward spiral, the same shape as those eerie footprints etched into the soil. My first thought was that Daniel was alive, wandering in circles and too disoriented to stop. My second thought, colder and harder, was that something else had his phone. We moved deeper into the clearing, every step feeling heavier than the last. The compass on my chest swung uselessly, spinning without pause, while the GPS unit flickered between coordinates like a failing heartbeat. At 20 feet from the spiral's center, the temperature dropped abruptly, not a gradual cooling, but a sharp plunge, as if we'd stepped into a different climate. Breath clouded in front of our faces. The forest around us dulled into silence. Even the wind seemed to halt at the boundary, unwilling to follow us in. Then came the ringing. Faint at first, distant and hollow, the sound of a phone buried deep beneath the earth. It pulsed in intervals, each tone bending strangely as though stretched thin across space. We dug again, frantic, following the sound. But the deeper we carved into the soil, the farther away it seemed to drift, receding just beyond reach. A volunteer swore it was coming from the air itself, suspended somewhere above us. Another swore it was behind the tree line. But when we stopped moving, the sound stopped too. Something was playing with us. Time unraveled as we searched. My watch said 32 minutes had passed, but the sun had barely shifted in the sky. Hunger gnawed at my stomach, yet it couldn't have been more than an hour since breakfast. Or was it 6? Shadows seemed to lengthen unnaturally, stretching like black roots across the clearing. My radio crackled with static, and in that static, faint but distinct, came a man's voice. "I'm still here," it whispered. "Still walking." Then silence. We followed the signal deeper into the trees, abandoning the clearing behind us. That's when we saw them. Fresh boot prints, identical to Daniel's, weaving through the undergrowth. But these weren't days old. They were minutes old, the soil still springing back from the weight. We pushed forward, our pulses thundering. Then, as quickly as they had appeared, the tracks ended. No scuffle, no leap, no sign of departure. Just a blank patch of earth where the trail dissolved into nothingness. Night began to fall, though we were certain we'd only been there an hour. The forest pressed closer, each trunk a dark sentinel. And then, through the rising fog, I saw movement. A flicker of a figure, too tall, too still, standing just beyond the tree line. Before I could shout, it melted back into the gloom, leaving only the echo of a bootstep circling endlessly behind us. We never found Daniel. The signal vanished with the sunrise, and the clearing returned to silence as if nothing had ever happened. But weeks later, far from those cursed coordinates, my phone buzzed once in the dead of night. A single ping, same frequency, same spiral fixed place, a map, a landscape, a set of coordinates. But now I wonder if there are places where maps fold in on themselves, where time knots and space curls, and where those who walk too far don't disappear. They simply keep walking, forever, just out of reach. By the time Dr. Maren Keller arrived, the forest had already claimed 3 people. All had vanished within a 5-mile radius, each disappearance preceded by the same unnerving report. Eyes, glowing, silent, and too high off the ground to belong to any known animal, watching from the tree line. Maren was a wildlife biologist, pragmatic to her core, and she arrived armed with motion sensors, night vision cameras, and a stubborn belief that everything strange can be explained by science. I clung to that belief too, because the alternative, that something unknown was stalking these woods, was a truth I wasn't ready to face. We set up our equipment along an old logging road where the last hiker had gone missing. The canopy above swallowed the afternoon light, draping everything in a permanent twilight. As the sun sank, the forest changed. Its sounds, the chatter of insects, the rustle of branches, grew distant, muffled, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. We checked our gear. Infrared sensors blinked green, cameras hummed, and the radios hissed quietly with static. And then, just after midnight, one of the sensors triggered. The feed was blurry at first, a smear of grayscale shapes moving too quickly for the camera's low-light capabilities. But there, between 2 trees, was something tall, unnervingly thin, and utterly still. It had no visible arms, no obvious head, just a vertical silhouette, like a shadow cast without a body. The frame cut out for a split second, and when it returned, the figure was gone. Maren replayed the footage over and over, muttering about lens artifacts, wind distortion, anything that would keep the explanation grounded. Yet each time the image resolved, the shape remained, silent, limbless, and wrong. The second night brought more. Motion sensors tripped in rapid succession, as though something, or several somethings, were darting through the undergrowth. But when we scanned with thermal scopes, we found nothing. No heat signatures, no bodies, just empty space. The data refused to align with any known animal behavior. Deer avoided the area. Coyotes skirted the perimeter. Even the birds seemed to have abandoned the canopy. It was as if the forest had grown eyes of its own, watching us from just beyond the veil of light. On the third night, a volunteer named Ellis insisted he saw movement beyond the ridge. Against protocol, he followed it, calling out as he disappeared into the dark. Minutes stretched into hours. His radio crackled once, a sharp breath, maybe a whisper, and then went dead. We scoured the area until dawn, finding only his flashlight half buried in pine needles, its beam aimed upward into empty branches. No tracks, no blood, no trace of Ellis at all. We replayed the footage from that night frame by frame, desperate for a clue. At 2:16 a.m., just before Ellis vanished, a pair of glowing orbs appeared at the edge of the frame, high, unblinking, and far apart, like lanterns suspended in the trees. They hovered there for 7 full seconds before vanishing as if swallowed by the dark. And standing there at that very spot the next night, I felt it, the weight of eyes on me, patient and unblinking. Whatever had taken Ellis wasn't gone. It was still there, still watching. We reported Ellis as missing by morning, though the word felt inadequate, too small for the enormity of what had happened. Search teams combed the ridge for days, dogs sweeping the underbrush, helicopters circling above, but there was nothing. It was as if the forest had opened its mouth and swallowed him whole. Maren tried to keep us grounded in science, talking about hidden sinkholes and disorientation, about how easily the woods can confuse the human mind. But even she grew quieter as the evidence refused to cooperate. Animals avoided the search zone entirely. Motion cameras caught flickers of vertical shapes, but never their source. And every night, those glowing eyes returned, hovering just beyond the reach of light. On the 5th night, we tried a new tactic. Maren set up a perimeter of high-sensitivity microphones, hoping to triangulate any movement. If the figures were animals, they would make noise, branches snapping, soil shifting. But the recordings revealed something stranger, a persistent low-frequency hum right at the edge of human hearing. It pulsed in intervals, almost rhythmic, and each time it surged, the eyes would appear. They weren't random. They were responding, listening, waiting. And for the first time, Maren didn't offer an explanation. She just stared into the dark and whispered, "We're not alone out here." Around 3 a.m., I decided to walk the perimeter alone, guided by a dim red light to protect my night vision. The forest was unnervingly still, the kind of silence that feels thick, like the air itself is listening. Then ahead of me, 2 orbs, pale, yellow-white, impossibly still. They hovered high in the trees, unblinking. I froze. They didn't move closer, but they didn't vanish either. They only watched. And in that moment, the distance between science and folklore felt paper-thin. These weren't the eyes of deer or owls. They were too large, too far apart, and they carried an intelligence I could feel in my bones. The next morning, we found something new. Near the ridge where Ellis had vanished, a ring of tree trunks had been stripped of bark at the same height, roughly 8 feet off the ground. Each was marked with strange, repeating scratches, as if something had gripped them tightly while circling the clearing. The pattern was deliberate, almost geometric, and it radiated outward from the spot where Ellis's flashlight had been found. Whatever had been there had not just passed through. It had been there. It had stayed. By the 7th day, even Maren admitted we might be chasing something we didn't understand. "We may be looking at a behavioral phenomenon we don't have language for yet," she said, her voice brittle. But deep down, I sensed the truth was simpler and far more unsettling. This wasn't behavior. It was intention, and intention meant awareness. We never found Ellis. The case was eventually closed as unresolved, another vanishing folded into the forest's long history of unanswered questions. But I still return sometimes, standing at the edge of that tree line as dusk falls. And every time they're there, patient, motionless and silent, watching from the dark as if waiting for me to step just a little closer. I used to believe the forest was indifferent, a silent witness to what we do beneath its branches. Now I'm not so sure. Some nights I lie awake and think about those eyes, not gone, not forgotten, just beyond the light. And I wonder if the missing are truly lost, or simply still here, standing among them, watching too. We'd been searching for Kara and Dylan for 5 days when we found the cabin, a structure no one remembered. No map recorded and no satellite image had ever captured. They were an experienced pair, seasoned hikers who had set out on a weekend trek and vanished without a trace. No radio contact, no signs of distress. Their trail simply ended at a grove of black spruce, the forest swallowing them whole. We swept grid after grid with dogs and drones, but the woods yielded nothing. And then, as the sun began to sink behind the ridge on the 6th day, the trees parted to reveal it, a squat, weathered cabin hunched in the clearing like it had been there for a century. Something about it felt wrong from the start. The angles were slightly off, as though the walls leaned subtly inward, and the windows were clouded from the inside with a film that caught the dying light in oily swirls. There were no paths leading to it, no foundation stones, not even a disturbance in the moss and pine needles blanketing the ground. It was as if the forest had simply stepped aside to make space for it. We approached cautiously. The door creaked inward at the lightest push, exhaling a stale, sweet scent like wet wood and rotting apples. Inside, dust motes hung in the air like tiny suspended stars. The interior was furnished, a narrow cot, a table, shelves lined with glass jars. Yet everything felt mismatched, like pieces plucked from different decades. A kerosene lamp that belonged to the 1930s. A tin coffee mug stamped with a 1952 manufacturer's mark. A hiking jacket from the early 2000s. It was as if the room had been collecting fragments of time. Then we found the photo. It was tucked into the frame of a cracked mirror, a faded black and white image of 2 women smiling outside this very cabin. The inscription on the back read, "Summer 1947." But according to every record we had, there had been no structures here before 1978. I felt a chill bloom in my chest. And it deepened when I noticed something else. A spiral carved into the floorboards, faint but deliberate, its grooves smooth from countless hands. In the small drawer of the table was a journal. Its pages were damp, the ink smudged but legible. The first page bore a name in shaky handwriting, Kara. My heart stuttered. Kara, the woman we were still searching for, had vanished only 7 days ago. Yet the journal spoke of weeks spent here, of nights lit by soft humming light, of footsteps in the walls, and doors that didn't stay where they were. The final entry stopped mid-sentence. It's outside again. Tonight, the forest beyond the windows fell utterly silent. No wind, no crickets. Even our radios lost signal, the static flattening into a single low hum that vibrated through the floorboards. One of our team members, Rhea, swore she saw the walls move, a subtle inhalation like the cabin itself was breathing. We agreed to stay until dawn, to document everything. But as darkness deepened and the humming grew louder, I began to wonder if we'd made a mistake. Because whatever this place was, it didn't feel abandoned. The first sign that something had changed came just after midnight. The temperature dropped sharply, so fast that our breath began to plume in the air, and the wood beneath our boots moaned as if burdened by weight. The low hum we'd heard earlier had deepened into something else, a pulsing resonance like the slow throb of a colossal heart beating somewhere beneath the earth. I pressed my ear to the wall and swore I felt it vibrating, a steady rhythm that matched nothing natural. Rhea wanted to leave, but curiosity rooted me to the spot. If this place truly wasn't supposed to exist, I needed to understand why it did. At 1:47 a.m., the forest stirred, not with wind or animal calls, but with something quieter, stranger, a faint tapping against the outer walls, deliberate and rhythmic, like knuckles on wood. It circled the cabin once, then twice, and then stopped directly beneath the window. We killed our flashlights and peered into the dark. 2 faint points of light glowed between the trees, hovering at eye level and pulsing gently with the same rhythm as the hum beneath our feet. They weren't fireflies. They weren't reflections. They were watching. The radio on the table crackled suddenly to life, hissing static before a voice cut through. Distant, trembling, familiar. "It's waiting," it whispered, the same words Kara had written in the journal. We froze. Then faintly, "Help us." The voice was joined by another, deeper and fractured, speaking words we couldn't understand. The static swallowed them both. When the radio fell silent again, the tapping resumed. Only now it was coming from inside the walls. Rhea bolted for the door, but it wouldn't open. It wasn't stuck, it was gone. Where the door had been was now an unbroken wall of aged wood, smooth and seamless. Panic rose like a tide. Windows, too, were no longer windows. They had become narrow slits showing nothing but a swirling darkness beyond, as if the forest had retreated and left a void in its place. The room itself seemed smaller, walls inching closer, angles warping in subtle, nauseating ways. It felt like we had stepped not into a building, but into a throat that was slowly swallowing us. At 3:12 a.m., the humming stopped. The silence that followed was worse, deep and absolute, pressing against the skin. And in that silence I heard footsteps moving slowly across the roof. They were heavy, deliberate, and unhurried, circling once before halting directly above us. The boards creaked. Something exhaled. Then, with a sound like tearing fabric, the ceiling above the cot shifted, stretching, bending, thinning. And for the briefest second, I saw an eye staring down through the wood. It blinked. And then it was gone. I must have lost consciousness because the next thing I remember is sunlight spilling through the trees. I was outside, lying in the clearing. The cabin was gone. No walls, no roof, no trace it had ever existed. Our gear lay scattered in the dirt, and Rhea was nowhere to be found. They listed the case as another disappearance, another mystery the forest refused to surrender. But I know what I saw. That impossible cabin stitched from different moments, breathing as if alive. And sometimes, when the wind moves just right, I hear that low pulsing hum beneath the earth again, as if the cabin isn't gone at all. As if it's only sleeping, waiting for the next person to step inside. It started with 5 college students and a weekend camping trip that should have been uneventful. They were biology majors from the nearby university, eager to study rare lichens deep in the northern woods. They sent a text from their base camp on a Friday afternoon, cheerful, ordinary, and then vanished. By Monday morning, rangers and volunteers had scoured 30 square miles of forest. No tents, no gear, not even a scrap of fabric. It was as though the forest had inhaled, and they had simply ceased to exist. I joined the search on the 4th day, and almost immediately something struck me as wrong. The forest felt organized in a way that nature rarely is, as if invisible lines were etched through the pines, guiding us toward something. That's when we found the first carving, a triangle carved clean into a tree trunk, its edges sharp and deliberate. A mile deeper, another appeared, larger and more complex, now with intersecting lines forming a pattern that resembled a compass rose. Over the next 2 days, more emerged, scattered across miles of terrain, circles nested within squares, spirals intersecting with jagged glyphs. None of them were random. All pointed like arrows toward something deeper in the forest. At first, the working theory was human involvement. Maybe the students had carved them as markers or part of some elaborate project. But a forensic botanist brought in to study the growth patterns made a chilling observation. The earliest carvings weren't fresh. They predated the disappearances by years, possibly decades, and yet new ones were appearing overnight. Fresh cuts, clean edges, the pale sap still weeping. It was as though someone, or something, was updating the map even as we followed it. Each new carving deepened the mystery. They seemed to change subtly when we returned to them, lines lengthening, shapes bending toward a new focal point. It reminded me of a living thing stretching toward the sun, shifting imperceptibly when unobserved. The forest was no longer just a setting. It felt complicit, as if it were speaking in a language we didn't understand. On the 7th day, the carvings converged. Their angles and bearings aligned perfectly, pointing toward a location roughly 4 miles north of the original campsite. We followed the trajectory through dense undergrowth and twisting ravines until the trees opened into a clearing I had never seen on any map. The air there was unnervingly still, the way a chapel feels moments before a sermon. At the center of the clearing stood a circle of stones, each worn smooth and arranged with mathematical precision. Around them, scattered like discarded offerings, were shoes, shirts, and backpacks, items identified as belonging to the missing students. Yet there was no blood, no bodies, no signs of struggle. Just the artifacts of people who seemed to have stepped neatly out of existence. I walked the perimeter, half expecting them to emerge from the shadows, laughing at the elaborate prank they had pulled. But the forest remained silent, and the clearing felt impossibly empty. Empty in the way a stage feels after the actors have left. And yet, as the wind shifted, I swore I heard something, a soft rustle. A breath, a whisper. It wasn't the wind at dawn. It was more people, more equipment, and far more questions than answers. Overnight, something had changed. The circle of stones remained, but the carvings on the surrounding trees had multiplied. Where there had been maybe a dozen symbols before, now there were hundreds. Spirals within spirals, lattice-like grids, shapes that echoed astronomical constellations and ancient runes. They hadn't been there the day before. And yet the cuts were fresh, the bark still damp, sap still bleeding. Someone, or something, had been working while we slept. A forensic team measured the spacing between each carving. It wasn't random. Each symbol was precisely aligned to the next, forming radial arms that all converged on the center of the clearing. "It's like a map," one specialist murmured, tracing a line from one tree to another. But a map of what? Theories spun wildly. Ley lines, star charts, even neural networks etched into wood. I tried to ground myself in logic, but the deeper we looked, the more the forest resisted explanation. It was as though the landscape itself had intentions, like it was drawing us closer. By late afternoon, we set up sensors around the clearing. Motion detectors, acoustic arrays, even ground-penetrating radar. Everything stayed silent until just past midnight, when one detector pinged. Then another, and another. Something was moving through the pines at extraordinary speed, circling us again and again. Cameras caught only blurs, vertical streaks slicing between trees too quickly for any human or animal. We raised floodlights, but they revealed nothing, only the carvings, shifting subtly in the harsh white glow, their edges seeming to crawl outward when we weren't looking. That's when we heard it. Voices. Faint, distant, carried on the wind. Laughter at first, light, human, then words fragmented and hard to place. One of the parents swore it was her daughter's voice calling her name. Another claimed he heard his son humming a song from childhood. The clearing fell utterly still, but the air pulsed with something unseen, a pressure that wrapped around us like an embrace we hadn't asked for. My chest tightened. It felt as if the missing were right there, just out of sight, standing among the trees. We followed the sound deeper into the forest, past the perimeter we had marked. There we found more clothing, socks, a water bottle, a pair of glasses neatly folded on a stump. They weren't scattered like debris. They were placed deliberately, almost ceremonially. At the base of one tree, etched deeper than any other mark, was a new carving. A perfect ring surrounding a single word. Here. No bodies were ever found. Not that night, not in the weeks that followed. The search was eventually called off, and the case filed away as another unsolved disappearance. But I still go back sometimes, drawn by something I can't quite name. And every time I do, there are new carvings waiting for me, new patterns etched into the bark. And always, always, the same words scratched into the heart of it all. Here. The forest remains unchanged, but the patterns keep growing, stretching farther each time, as if drawing a map for someone else to follow. And when the wind dies and the pines fall silent, I swear I can hear them breathing, the missing, not gone at all, but waiting. Just beyond the tree line. The transmission began at 2:11 a.m., faint and fractured like a ghost trying to speak through static. We were huddled in the command tent reviewing maps when the radio, one tuned to an emergency frequency no one had touched in years, crackled to life. "Help, please." The voice was a woman's, breathless and trembling, followed by a string of coordinates repeated 3 times before the signal dissolved into silence. We stared at one another in disbelief. Channel 9 hadn't been active in decades. No one used it anymore, and yet someone out there was calling for help. At first we assumed it was interference, stray radio chatter bouncing off the mountains or an accidental transmission from a nearby station. But when we cross-referenced the coordinates, the blood drained from my face. They pointed to a sector deep inside the reserve, a place known as Deadwater Ridge, where no one had lived or camped for nearly 40 years. The area had been sealed off after a landslide in the 80s, deemed too unstable for hikers. And yet, at that exact location, someone was calling us. By dawn, a small team was assembled, and I was among them. We moved fast, cutting through thick fog that clung to the trees like wet fabric. The deeper we went, the quieter the forest became. Birdsong faded, wind softened. Even our footfalls felt muted, as if the air itself had thickened. It was a silence that pressed against the ribs, the kind that makes you whisper without knowing why. After 6 hours of trekking, we found it. A small clearing ringed by pines, and at its heart, a campsite. It was precisely where the coordinates had led us. The tents were old, canvas gone gray with age, and the fire pit was choked with ash so pale it crumbled at a touch. Everything was coated in a film of moss and decay, as though it had been abandoned decades ago. And yet, scattered around the camp were modern supplies, a nylon pack, a plastic water bottle, even a map dated just last month. It was as if 2 timelines had collided here and fused into one. Inside one of the tents, we discovered something that stopped us cold, a logbook. Its leather cover was cracked with age, its first entries written in faded ink from the 1980s. But the last 3 pages were new, fresh ink, crisp lines, and signed with a name we knew, Evelyn Shaw. She was the woman we'd been searching for all week, missing since last Tuesday. Her final entry was dated just 2 days prior. "Signal weak. Still transmitting. If anyone hears this, follow the coordinates." We radioed base with the discovery, but before we could finish, Channel 9 came alive again. "Help, please." "They're here." The voice was Evelyn's, the same one from the transmission. But the signal wasn't coming from the ridge around us. It was coming from inside the camp. I turned slowly, my heart hammering. The radio hissed again, and in that hiss something shifted. A whisper beneath her words, deeper, older, like a second voice hiding behind the first. It wasn't just a call for help. It was something else. Something waiting. We tore the camp apart, convinced the transmitter had to be here. A hidden beacon, a buried radio, anything that could explain how Evelyn's voice was still broadcasting. But there was nothing. No batteries, no antenna, no power source of any kind, and yet the signal grew stronger, clearer, as if whatever was speaking was aware we were listening. At 3:14 p.m., the voice returned again, closer now, stripped of static. "Help me." I'm cold, then a pause. "Please, don't let them find me." "Who?" I whispered to no one, but the forest answered with silence. The logbook offered more clues, though none that made sense. One page described lights in the trees that moved in perfect sync. Another spoke of voices on the wind that called her name even when she was alone. The final line, scrawled hastily in smeared ink, simply read, "It's not an echo. It's them." The words gnawed at me. Not an echo. Was this truly Evelyn, alive and trying to reach us? Or was something mimicking her, repeating fragments of the past like a stuck record? Night fell quickly on Deadwater Ridge, swallowing the clearing in a heavy velvet dark. The radio still hissed faintly, Evelyn's pleas threading in and out like a heartbeat. Then, at 2:11 a.m., the exact time the first call had come through, the signal shifted. "They're here," she whispered, her voice raw with terror. "They found me. Please." The transmission cut off mid-sentence, replaced by a low rhythmic clicking. It was steady, mechanical, almost like Morse code, but the pattern repeated the same sequence over and over. 3 short, 1 long, 3 short. Essos, we followed it. Every instinct screamed at us to stay put, but curiosity, or something deeper, pulled us toward the sound. It led us through the trees, deeper into the ridge, until the forest thinned and we stood before another clearing. At its center was a rusted radio tower, long collapsed and half swallowed by the earth. Its call sign plaque was nearly illegible, but one detail sent a chill through me. The tower had gone offline in 1984. It could not be broadcasting, and yet it was. The clicking emanated from beneath the twisted metal, and layered faintly beneath it, Evelyn's voice again. "Help me!" Only now it wasn't just a plea. It was a loop. The same inflection, the same breath, perfectly identical every 17 seconds. Whatever we were hearing wasn't live. It wasn't even recent. By dawn, the signal was gone. Base confirmed no active transmissions on Channel 9. The logbook disappeared from evidence. Even the coordinates Evelyn had whispered no longer matched the location of the clearing. It was as if the forest had folded the entire event back into itself. Weeks later, long after the search was called off, my radio crackled awake in the dead of night. "Help me," Evelyn's voice whispered, as clear as the day we first heard it. Same tone, same breath, same 17-second loop, only this time the coordinates she spoke weren't for Deadwater Ridge. They were for the search headquarters, where I was standing, alone. I used to believe that radio signals faded and died like echoes in the air, but now I wonder if some never do, if they circle endlessly, untethered from time, carrying voices that no longer exist. And maybe, just maybe, they're not echoes at all. Maybe they're doors. And maybe something is still trying where the forest changes. Not gradually, like it should, but all at once, as if some invisible line splits the land into 2 different worlds. On one side, the pines grow tall and straight. Birds chatter from canopy to canopy, and the soil is rich with moss and wild mushrooms. On the other, the ground turns pale and brittle. The trees twist like they're recoiling from something underground, and the silence is so complete it feels alive. It's along this strange boundary, this divide, that every disappearance I've investigated in the last 12 years has occurred. It started as a pattern buried in paperwork. Names, dates, GPS coordinates, separate on their own, but when plotted on a map, they formed a crooked crescent hugging that tree line like a shadow. Every case was the same. A camper vanishes mid-hike. A ranger never returns from patrol. A hiker's gear is found abandoned just feet from the boundary, as if they'd stepped across it and never stepped back. At first I thought it was coincidence. Now, I'm not so sure. We brought in geologists to study the area. and their findings raised more questions than answers. The soil composition shifted dramatically at the divide, with unusually high concentrations of rare minerals deep below the surface. Ground-penetrating radar suggested something even stranger. The faint outline of a massive, hollow structure buried far beneath the ridge. It wasn't natural, at least not in any way we understood. Could be an ancient lava tube, one geologist offered. Another wasn't convinced. "It's too linear," she said, tracing the map with a trembling finger. "Almost engineered. Still, science only got us so far." Animals refused to cross the line. Deer turned back abruptly, circling wide to avoid it. Birds that soared overhead veered sharply as they approached, like pilots steering clear of restricted airspace. Even insects seemed to vanish, their endless hum fading to nothing once you stepped into the pale soil. I told myself it was coincidence, instinct, some subtle environmental cue we couldn't yet detect. But deep down, I knew instinct only behaves that way when it senses something we can't. We set up night vision cameras along the boundary, hoping to catch evidence of movement. What we saw unsettled even the most skeptical among us. Figures, tall, thin, and fast, darted between the trees beyond the divide. They moved in deliberate patterns, tracing arcs and circles, but when we switched to thermal imaging, the screen went blank. Whatever they were, they gave off no heat at all. One night, I decided to cross. Call it stubbornness or recklessness, but I needed to know. As I stepped over the invisible threshold, the change was immediate. The air thinned and cooled, and the forest around me fell into absolute silence. Even my breath felt heavier, dragged down by something I couldn't name. My flashlight beam seemed to shrink, its light devoured by the darkness ahead. And then I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being followed. A weight in the air just behind me, matching my pace. I turned, but nothing moved. Nothing ever moved, and yet the feeling only grew stronger, pressing closer. As if something unseen was studying me from just beyond the edge of the dark. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back. But curiosity, or something deeper, held me there. I took another step, then another, the ground beneath me soft and strangely hollow, as if I were walking atop a buried chamber. My radio hissed and died, its signal swallowed by the air. Even the compass clipped to my jacket spun uselessly, its needle whirling in frantic circles. It was as though I had stepped not just into another part of the forest, but into a different set of rules entirely, a place where the laws I trusted had quietly rewritten themselves. At roughly 30 meters beyond the divide, I stopped. Ahead, the trees grew denser and darker, their trunks warped into grotesque spirals as if twisted by unseen hands. My flashlight flickered, and in that strobing light I saw a movement, a flicker of something tall slipping between the trees. It wasn't a deer. It wasn't anything I recognized. And then there was sound, faint but unmistakable, footsteps. They came from every direction at once, slow and deliberate, closing the distance without ever revealing a shape. My heart pounded. Each step I took forward was mirrored by a step behind me, like a dance I hadn't agreed to join. When I finally spoke into the darkness, my voice sounded foreign. I called out a name, any name, hoping for an echo. What came back wasn't my voice. It was deeper, distorted, and wrong, a low murmur that repeated my words a half-second too late. I tried again. Again, the forest mimicked me, each syllable warped and hollow as if spoken through water. That's when I realized it wasn't echoing me. It was learning me. The soil beneath my boots trembled, a subtle vibration that pulsed in time with my heartbeat. It grew stronger the closer I stepped toward the heart of that twisted grove. When I knelt to collect a sample, my gloved fingers came back coated in fine, metallic dust, unlike any soil I'd seen before. I pocketed it, though part of me already knew we wouldn't be able to explain what it was. I turned back toward the divide, but something had changed. The trees no longer looked the same. Landmarks I had marked in my head, a split birch, a moss-covered stump, were gone. The path behind me had folded in on itself, sealing me in a labyrinth that hadn't existed moments before. That's when I saw them. Faint, flickering shapes weaving silently between the trees. They moved too quickly to focus on, too smoothly to be human, and every time my light brushed over them, they vanished, leaving only the sense of eyes lingering in the dark. Panic finally won. I stumbled backward until my boot struck a ridge of earth. Without warning, the silence shattered. a deep, resonant hum rising from the ground beneath me, vibrating through my bones. And then, as abruptly as it began, it stopped. The air warmed. The sounds of the forest returned. I was back on the other side of the divide, my knees buried in soft moss, the world ordinary again. Weeks later, the soil sample I'd taken was analyzed. Its composition was unlike anything local, rich in trace metals found deep beneath the Earth's crust, far below where any tree could grow. It's as if the forest is sitting atop something that isn't supposed to be there, one geologist whispered. I still think about that moment beyond the tree line, the silence, the mimicry, the sensation that something ancient and patient was standing just out of sight. Maybe the missing never vanished. Maybe they simply stepped where I stepped and never found their way back. When they found him, he was barefoot and shivering at the edge of the tree line, his clothes torn, his eyes vacant and glassy like a sleepwalker's. 17-year-old Liam Brooks had been missing for 112 days. Search parties had scoured every ravine, every trail, every dry creek bed for weeks before finally declaring the case cold. And yet, here he was standing exactly where he'd last been seen, as if no time had passed at all. He blinked at the officers who approached, confused, and asked if his parents were still waiting at the trailhead. To him, it was still the same afternoon he'd vanished. I was assigned to interview him the next morning, and nothing could have prepared me for what I saw. Liam was thinner, yes, gaunt, even but not malnourished in the way someone lost for months should have been. His vitals were stable. His muscles showed no signs of atrophy. Even stranger, his skin bore faint, symmetrical markings along his ribs and neck, patterns that looked more like surgical incisions than injuries from the wild. He's been cared for, the attending physician whispered. Or studied. Neurologists chalked up his fragmented memory to trauma. They said isolation could warp a mind, bend time perception, erase weeks or months like chalk from a slate. But Liam spoke with unnerving certainty. He described descending into what he called the rooms beneath the forest, corridors of smooth stone illuminated by a pale light that seemed to come from nowhere. He remembered faces without eyes leaning close to examine him, their presence heavy but silent, as if communication didn't require words. Most chilling of all, he swore he hadn't eaten or drunk anything since the day he vanished, yet he wasn't dehydrated. When his parents arrived, the reunion was raw and tearful, but the joy was tempered by something harder to name: fear. They noticed it too. The subtle wrongness in his movements, the way he sometimes paused mid-sentence as if listening to something distant, the way his gaze lingered too long on empty corners of the room. At night, nurses reported finding him awake and standing perfectly still by the window, staring into the tree line as if waiting for something. A week into his hospital stay, the lab results arrived. That's when everything shifted. Liam's blood contained trace elements that didn't belong, isotopes rarely found near the surface, more common to deep subterranean rock. Even more alarming, geneticists flagged anomalies in his DNA. Tiny, inexplicable mutations had appeared, not random damage, but deliberate changes, like someone had edited his code. "It's not possible," one of them muttered. "Not in a human time frame." The official report suggested mislabeling or lab error, but no one truly believed it. Not after everything we'd seen. And late one night, I asked Liam where he'd really been. He looked at me for a long time, as though deciding whether I deserved the truth. Then he leaned closer and whispered, "They showed me what's underneath." I asked him what he meant, but he only smiled faintly, eyes drifting once again toward the forest outside his window, toward the darkness that had given him back. The restless pacing, the long silences, the half-whispered conversations with no one. They all grew worse. He'd sit by the window for hours, tracing invisible lines on the glass with his fingertip, murmuring phrases too faint to catch. "It's waiting," I heard once. "It's close." Staff wrote it off as lingering trauma. I wasn't so sure. It didn't feel like trauma. It felt like anticipation. The geneticists ran more tests, desperate to explain the anomalies. What they found deepened the mystery. The mutations in Liam's DNA weren't just random. They seemed purposeful, clustered around genes related to circadian rhythms, spatial awareness, even sensory perception. "It's as if he's been adapted," one researcher said quietly. "But for what?" The question hung heavy in the air, unanswered. When we showed Liam the results, he only shrugged. "I told you," he said softly. "They changed me so I could understand." The phrase haunted me. So I could understand. Understand what? When I pressed him, he described things that defied explanation. A vast hollow beneath the forest, rooms older than the trees, a heartbeat in the stone. He spoke of being watched, not with eyes, but with intentions. He spoke of others who lived in that hollow and walked between the roots, shaping and reshaping what lay above. "They've always been here," he told me once, voice barely audible. "We just forgot how to see them." 2 days later, Liam vanished again. His room door was still locked, the window sealed, the security footage showing nothing but static for 13 minutes. When the cameras flickered back to life, the bed was empty. The only trace he left behind was a smear of soil on the floor, pale, granular, and laced with the same rare isotopes we'd found in his blood. It was identical to the samples collected near the deepest part of the forest, a place no one had disturbed in decades. The search was immediate and frantic. Police swept the grounds, drones combed the surrounding woods, but Liam was gone. The hospital director insisted he must have found a way out. "There's no other explanation," he said, though his eyes betrayed doubt. I returned to the tree line that evening, retracing the path where he'd been found. As the sun dipped below the canopy, a strange stillness fell over the forest, the same dense, listening silence I'd felt once before. Then I heard it. A voice, distant, muffled, but unmistakably his. "Down here," it whispered. "Come see." My radio hissed alive with interference, and for a moment, every compass needle on our team spun wildly before dying completely. I took one step forward, and then another. The ground beneath me thrummed faintly like something vast and ancient shifting far below, and in that vibration I felt it too, the heartbeat Liam had spoken of. We never found him. The investigation remains open, his disappearance now an unsolved case layered atop the first. But sometimes, late at night, Channel 9 will crackle faintly to life, and always it's the same message, a boy's voice, calm and patient, whispering from somewhere deep below. "I understand now," he says, "and soon you will too. Some say Liam is gone. I don't believe that. I think he's still here, just beneath our feet, in those rooms under the forest he described. And I fear that whatever changed him isn't finished with us yet." After years of documenting vanishings, I began to notice what no one else seemed willing to admit. The disappearances weren't scattered randomly across the forest. They circled, spiraled, and bled into one another, each one bending back toward the same region, a patch of woodland so unstable that maps never agreed on its shape. On paper, it shifted with each survey, boundaries curling in on themselves like a snake eating its own tail. Trails vanished there. Streams cut in directions they shouldn't. Compasses spun uselessly. And every time someone went missing, that's where the trail ended, at the edge of this uncertain place. Locals had their own name for it. They called it the Ode Ground. Stories passed through generations warned that the forest always collects its debts. If you took too much, strayed too far, ignored the whispers to turn back, it would take something in return. Some swore they had seen shapes along the ridges at dusk, silhouettes standing still, silent, always just far enough to blur into the tree line. Watchers, they called them, not predators, not ghosts. Something older, something patient. I told myself I didn't believe in such things. But the weight of the files on my desk said otherwise. Rangers lost, hunters swallowed mid-trail. Entire search teams reporting strange lights in the fog, or hearing their own names whispered from the dark. All of it bending back to that one shifting region, as if the land itself was marking territory in blood. It was during my final case that the pattern became undeniable. A hiker named Dana Avery had vanished 3 weeks earlier, her pack found torn open just yards from the divide. She was the 27th disappearance I'd cataloged that touched the Ode Ground. I told myself this would be the one where I found an answer, some thread of clarity to pull. Instead, it led me deeper into the uncertainty than I had ever gone before. The search began like so many others, grids marked on maps, volunteers combing the brush, radios hissing with static. But by the third day, something shifted. Our GPS units failed. Trails we had flagged twisted into new routes overnight. One group swore they had passed the same boulder 3 times in a row. Another insisted they had seen someone walking just ahead, but when they caught up, the figure dissolved into fog. I couldn't dismiss these things anymore. The forest wasn't simply confusing us. It was moving around us, and then came the clearing. I stumbled on it near dusk, the fog heavy and low to the ground. At first glance it looked ordinary, just another pocket of open space between the trees. But scattered across the ground were objects, a patchwork of belongings spanning decades. A rusted canteen, a faded flannel shirt, a child's shoe split at the sole, and near the center, a modern backpack, its nylon strap still intact. Dana's initials were stitched into the fabric. The clearing was silent, but not empty. From the fog at the tree line, something stirred, something shifted in the clearing. It was subtle at first, a ripple in the fog, a tremor in the air, but it was enough to send a shiver crawling down my spine. I wasn't alone. I could feel it, the way you can feel a storm before you hear thunder. The presence was heavy and deliberate, like eyes pressing into my back from the dark. I turned slowly, scanning the tree line, but the mist clung thick and stubborn, swallowing shapes before they could fully form. And yet, just beyond my vision, something was moving. I stepped deeper into the clearing. The ground was soft beneath my boots, littered with layers of forgotten lives. A tin lunchbox from the 1960s, a ranger badge tarnished with age, a water bottle stamped with last year's date, decades of belongings from those who had walked this same path and never returned, all piled together as if placed there intentionally. It wasn't random. It was curated, like offerings at an altar. The fog thickened. Somewhere beyond it, a branch snapped, sharp, close, deliberate. My flashlight beam cut through the haze and caught a figure at the edge of the trees. It was tall and still, its outline stretched unnaturally long, as if the forest itself had drawn it. I blinked, and it was gone. A second figure appeared on the opposite side of the clearing. Then another, and another, always at the edge, always watching. They didn't move closer, but the circle was tightening. "Who are you?" I whispered into the silence, though part of me already knew the answer. They were the stories the locals spoke of, the watchers on the ridges, the silhouettes at dusk. I had thought them myth, superstition born from grief. But myths don't breathe, and I could hear them breathing. My radio crackled with static. A voice, faint and distorted, bled through. "Leave it," it said. Then another followed, layered and low. "It's owed," the same phrase I had read in dozens of case reports, heard whispered by elders in town. The forest keeps what it's owed. The meaning had always been metaphorical, until now. The fog pulsed once more, and the watchers moved as one. It was subtle, a shift of posture, a collective step closer. The clearing seemed to shrink, the tree line pressing inward like the walls of a tightening lung. My chest constricted. I stumbled backward and nearly tripped over something buried in the soil. Brushing away the dirt, I froze. It was a camera, old, rusted, the film still inside. The label etched on the back bore a date, June 12, 1983, the day 3 hikers had vanished from this very ridge. The forest hadn't hidden their belongings. It had displayed them. The watchers were closer now. I could feel their gaze slide over me like a hand. And then, as quickly as they had appeared, they faded into the mist, swallowed whole by the trees. The clearing was empty once more, or at least it looked that way. I left that night with the weight of a truth I can't shake. The forest isn't indifferent. It isn't passive. It remembers every footstep and claims what it's owed, one name at a time. And now, when I walk those trails alone, I no longer ask where the missing went. I ask how long the forest will wait before it decides to collect again. Subscribe, if you dare.